I remember I tweeted it out and like got a good response, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Maybe a couple weeks after, or like, you tweeted at me, and then you said, you asked me, can I hang this above my desk?
I just remember being struck by it, and there was something about it that spoke to me that I wanted to be able to see and engage with, when I was working on my own work. Poetry especially, I feel like, reminds me of what is possible on the page. And every line is a revelation. And I want my prose to function in that way. Like choosing to live and to get up in the morning and to breathe the entire lives of enslaved people. And I thought their whole lives were an act of resistance.
From the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. Never got a chance to experience for themselves.
Learning about the past, it didn't depress you, right? That it empowered you in a way.
Clint Smith, #1 New York Times bestseller.
Jesmyn, the only woman and the only black person to win the National Book Award for fiction twice.
I think it is important for us to tell these stories so that they are accessible and so that they are there and so that, we are very actively resisting the rewriting of our history. Hey, Clint.
This is very cool for me because I don't know if you remember, but in 2014 or 15, I had just come to start publishing poems like in journals, and like I came from spoken word background, I remember like sort of cohort of people that I came up in the spoken word community with started applying to like Cave Canem and Callaloo, and started publishing their work in journals, and I was like, oh, is that what we're on? Like, okay, cool. Like, I didn't know we were publishing.
Right.
And so I started like thinking about what my work might look like on the page, and I started publishing some of my work. And one of the first poems I had published was this poem, What the Cicada Said to the Black Boy. And I remember I like tweeted it out. This was when Twitter was great and fun.
Yes.
And, like, it was not a cesspool of, craziness.
Right.
I remember I tweeted it out and like got a good response, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Maybe a couple weeks after, or like, you tweeted at me, and then I was like, what? Just tweeted that, because I already said the poems. Like I was like, oh snap! And then you said, it's like 10 years ago, but you were just like, I think you said, you either asked me, can I hang this above my desk, or you were told like I'm gonna hang this above my desk,
right?
And that for me, in a moment where I was like I hadn't published any books, I hadn't. I'd published 2 or 3 poems like in the world that weren't like behind a mic on a stage, and it was like, man, Jesmynward, my poem above her desk. It was I can't even begin to tell you like how cool a moment that was for me. And then here we are 10 years later.
Right.
So I appreciate that very much.
No, thank you for sharing that with me. I mean, I remember, vaguely, because like you said, it was so many years ago, but I just remember being struck by it, and there was something about it that spoke to me that I wanted to be able to see and engage with, when I was working on my own work. I don't know, there was something about that poem that really, I don't know, just spoke about the kinds of lives that I try to write about and follow in my own work. And I feel like I'm always doing things to try to keep like the reality of those lives close to me. And so hanging your poem above my desk where I could see it when I was working, like for me, that's, that was one of my ways to try to like keep that awareness and that awareness and the like that beauty, I don't know, and the violence and the ugliness and the joy, just like keep everything that poem called up. Like that was my way of trying to keep that awareness sort of close to me, if that makes sense.
Is that a thing is that like a habit of yours? Like, do you find things in the world, pieces of art, or like different things that you put in proximity to when you're writing?
Yeah. And that's all. I usually, like I love poetry. I would love to publish a collection of poetry one day. I don't, not anymore. I used to all the time. So, I don't know, maybe if I live to be like 70 or something, then I'll try to publish when I'm 70. But no, so I read a lot of poetry, and when I come across a poem that just, that speaks to me in a way, or that opens me up in a way, or that hits on the, like I said, like the reality of the people, who I try to write about in my own work. Like I want to keep it close to me, right? Because I think poetry especially, I feel like reminds me of what is possible on the page, right? And it's something that I realize that I'm trying to do more and more in my prose, is that one of the things that I love about poetry is that I feel like every line is so purposeful and every line is a revelation, right? And I want my prose to function in that way, which, I guess that's not the best strategy when you want to reach the widest audience.
Would disagree. National Book Awards and Oprah. I think the wider public has. I think they're perfectly fine with.
I don't know. I mean, some people. I sometimes I think, I don't know. I feel like I run into both types of readers, right? I feel like I encounter both types of readers. Like I encounter readers who say the only thing that they want to read is work like that challenges them and work that requires them to work, right? And to, decipher what is going on the page and to engage with it and wrestle with it. And then I also run into plenty of other types of readers. I feel like especially with my most recent book with Let Us Descend, where, people feel like reality now is so difficult and that life now is so difficult. And so they don't want to do more work on the page. They'd rather read something that, where the prose is not difficult, where the prose is straightforward and streamlined and very clean, and, and where the subject matter, I guess, is a little less difficult than the subject matter in a lot of my work.
I've been thinking a lot about that. Obviously, Let Us Descend is about enslavement. How the Word Is Passed is nonfiction book about enslavement. But I've been thinking a lot about a sort of similar thing where people, a lot of our folks, right, like Black folks, feel tired,
right,
and weary,
right,
and as you said, there's so much violence that we are proximate to, that we bear witness to, that we have to engage with,
right,
and the idea of on our own time, our free time, more deeply engaging with those stories, and specifically in the context of enslavement. I am sympathetic to the argument or the idea that people are like, I'm not going to watch that movie.
Right.
I'm not going to pick up that book.
Right.
I get it. And I also think it's incumbent upon us not to turn away from it. Right. And that is the sort of, that's the balance that we're always trying to find. I mean, it's the balance that I try to figure out with my own kids. Right. Like, we got the books about, the little kids book about Harriet Tubman, Douglass, and Ida B. Wells, Scott King. And we have the books about the little black girl who wants to be a robot. Right. A little black boy who wants to be a scientist. Right. A black child who wants to grow up and be a bottle cat or a Pokemon. And I feel like you have to have all of it. Right. Because I want my kids to understand, as black children in this country, to understand the lineage from which they come. I want them to understand that they come from a history that is saturated with violence, with oppression, with enslavement, with segregation. Because I think you have to understand that to understand the contemporary landscape of inequality, to understand who you are in relationship to your own life, your country, your history. But I also don't want them to feel like that is what their lives or their histories are singularly defined by. Right? Like, this is a part of it, and it's a big part of it. Right. But it's not all of it. Right. And your future is not dictated by that history. It's dictated by the sort of contours of your imagination.
Right.
And so, I think about that in the context of my kids. I think about that in the context of the wider public. Like I definitely have friends who are like, no, I'm not going to like watch that movie. I'm going to watch
Right.
Love is Blind.
Right.
I'm not going to watch. And I just think that there's room for all of it.
Right.
And there has to be.
Right.
Because if we don't engage with it at all, then I think we fall back into a trap that we were in, I think, certainly in my childhood, in which these conversations were not present at all.
Right.
In our schools,
Right.
in our public discourse.
Right.
And as a result, I grew up with a distorted, incomplete sense of what this country was,
Right.
who I was in relationship to this
Right.
country. So it's this sort of like, what is the balance and how do you figure it out?
Right. I think that idea of balance is really important. And I know that it's something that I strive for in my life, and then also with my children too, because we've started having, those difficult conversations because they're asking me, things about race or I don't know, they come up with, they have access to the internet, right? And so they're coming to me asking me questions about, life, and I'm trying to explain as best as I can, while I have their attention. But I think, it's one of the things that I usually say whenever someone asks me that question, like about because I guess Salvage the Bones has been on some banned books lists, so that's something that people ask me about sometimes, and so one of the things that I always say is that I wish that I had had access to more books that would have provided me with the keys to better understand the life that I was living, right? To better understand, like, the fact that, that generations of my family had lived in poverty, right? And to understand perhaps why that was the case. To better understand why, the education at my public elementary school that I went to, why it wasn't that great, why we lacked certain resources, to better understand, why kids in my, in the high school that I went to when I switched to this private high school would say things like, they would say, oh, the only reason that you're getting this and this and this is because of affirmative action, right? Or or they would, I don't know, they would say that like that the playing field was level and, and we were all capable of the same things as if we all had the same resources, right?
Work hard, like
Right.
else, then everything will be fine.
Right. And so I, of course, was not taught any of, I wasn't taught any of it, right? Like in school, and didn't really have access to it outside of school because I was depending on my school libraries, and they didn't carry the books that I needed necessarily in order to better understand the context of my, the different like circumstances in my life. So I don't know. That's one reason that I think fight for Salvage the Bones, fight for Singing Bird Sing, and, fight for like Let Us Descend, fight it as in trying to get it out to as many people as I can, and especially get it into the hands of young people who I think, probably rightly so at first, are resistant to it, right? But I don't know. I want to provide them with those keys. I want them to have a different understanding of who they are and of how they and the people that they love, like why they live in the communities that they live in. And I feel like that's one of the things that we do in our work.
Yeah, I mean, that is why I wrote How the Word is Best, for sure. I mean, it is, people, I think, ask Black authors a lot, like who the audience for that book is.
Right.
Who you write it for.
Right.
And there's a lot of layers to that question. And I think a lot of reasons that it's asked of Black authors,
Right.
I think more than white authors or
Right.
other specifically white authors. And I always tell people that like this was really written for like a 15-year-old version of me.
Right.
Like I wanted to try to write the sort of book that I felt like I needed in my high school American history class.
Right.
Because I remember, you know, the one that's is my home. Like,
Right.
I remember growing up here in the 80s and 90s and just being inundated with all these messages about all the things that were wrong with black people. The violence and the crime and the drugs and the addiction and the poverty were all black people's fault.
Right.
And it was coming from the media, it was coming from politicians. And if you're inundated with these messages like over and over again, your entire life, and nobody ever gives you the language or the toolkit or the context or the keys, as you say, with which to understand that is like pathology and that is a distortion, and that what you're hearing about there being something wrong with a group of people rather than the things that have been given to or not given to people, then you sort of begin to misunderstand the problem. I remember being a kid and just feeling this like profound paralysis, right? A sort of like I was in a straitjacket almost, and I was like, I knew what I was hearing was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong.
Right.
But then if you keep hearing something about yourself and you don't have the language to push back against it, part of you begins to believe it.
You believe it.
It becomes internalized, and then you're like, I don't think this is right.
Right.
But maybe it's right.
Right.
Maybe I'm different, or maybe.
Right.
And I remember when I first began to encounter work by novelists and artists and filmmakers and sociologists and historians whose work transformed my understanding of the history of New Orleans, of Louisiana, of this country, of this world. It was like so emancipatory. It was so freeing. It was just like, I felt like I think a lot of times people think that if you teach black kids about terrible things that happen in black history, that it can feel overwhelming, it can feel stifling, that it can make people feel sad. And I think if it's not taught well, that can be the case for sure.
Right.
But I think if you do it right, like I know for me, it was the opposite of that.
Right.
It was like, gave me a sense of agency.
Right.
It was a sense of like, oh, this is not an inevitability in black culture. This is not a sort of static, immovable notion or object. This is something that is the result of public policy decisions and legal decisions and judicial decisions that are made, and then that means we can make different decisions.
Right.
And I think novels are so uniquely suited to do that kind of work, and also something else, because I reread Salvage. I was like, last time I read this was like 10 years ago. But I reread it before because I knew we were going to be in conversation, and I was just so struck by how rich the interior lives of the characters were, and characters who historically in American literature have not been afforded rich, complicated interior lives, interior selves. And who, when you see like these Southern Mississippi black kids, black teenagers, your conception of what you think they are might be this one thing, but you provided the reader with insight into a level of, again, just like interiority, a level of complication that I think is just like what fiction at its best is about. Like what makes it different than a pamphlet, what makes it different than a polemic, what makes it different. It's like, these are not perfect people.
Right.
These are people who are struggling in relationship to the forces around them, who are also people. And I think the reason that so much of the sort of propaganda and pathology around black people was effective to the wider public is because the wider public did not always conceive and does not always conceive of black people as people, the way that they conceive of themselves.
Right. I think you're totally right. Like, especially, I think the kind of people that I write about and the kids, especially in Salvage the Bones, because on top of them being young and black and Southern, right, which I think to certain, I don't know, audiences probably makes them alien in a way, but then they also come from a very poor background, which I think is, reflected in all of my work, because that's the kind of people I come from. So that's the kind of people I write about, right? But I think that that what you're saying is right about like the power of the novel. In that it can align you so closely, with a person who is going through something, right? And it can sort of open them up to you, and make you feel as if you are living that experience with them. That I do think that it makes you feel with them, right? So that when you come out of the book, hopefully the way that you see the world and the way that you see the kind of people, that we write about, like that's different. That's changed because they're not so alien to you anymore. They're not so removed from you anymore because you feel like you've lived this person's experience. I feel like that's also like just the work of at least the kind of novels that I write, right? Where I'm like very invested in enabling the reader to sink into the character's experience and sink into the character's world and really feel like you are experiencing everything with them, that they're going through.
How do you think about, because you've written nonfiction and you've written novels, is your, like when you wrote your memoir as compared to salvage, like both are informed by like your real life experience. When you, what made it so that you wanted to make your memoir a memoir rather than to do what many novelists do, which is transport your lived experience onto fictional characters,
fictional,
and then just render it as fiction. That might give you the space to do more stuff, or like this happened in my real life, but with this character I can do this and convey this message. Did you ever think about making that a novel? Or
I think that I thought about it for like 10 minutes. But then I came to two conclusions. One is that the sequence of events was so preposterous and so just ridiculous and tragic, right? That I felt like if I were to fictionalize it, the reader would not be able to suspend their disbelief. Like it'd be like, this never happens to anyone, right? You don't lose five young men, right? 5 people you love in 5 years or 4 years. It just doesn't happen that way, right? So that's one of the reasons. And then the other reason is, like at the heart of the memoir of Men We Reaped is my brother, right? And so he was killed by a drunk driver when he was 19. The drunk driver hit him from behind. My brother was coming home from work. He was working a shift that he actually wasn't on the schedule for, but he just took it at the last minute to get money. And when at the end of, after the drunk driver killed my brother, the drunk driver, walked away without a scratch. It took them a while to actually figure out that my brother had been hit by a drunk driver, because the accident took place on the beach. And so the drunk driver hit my brother, and then his car jumped over 4 lanes of a highway and went into the sand. And so that night, after they discovered my brother's car, that night, they thought that he had just lost control of his car. And they were blaming it on him. And then it wasn't until the next morning where they saw the drunk driver's car on the sand on the beach that they realized that something else had happened. Anyhow, I'm saying this is a very Black phrase. Long story short, which is not lost. I'm not making it very short, but long story short, the drunk driver was never charged with my brother's murder. Right? He was charged with, and I still don't fully understand why this happened, but he was charged with leaving the scene of an accident, and that was it. And so I felt like in that verdict that my brother's entire existence had been erased. You know, like for me, the subtext in that ruling was that he might as well, like, did he even really exist? I mean, you know, and I feel like, you know, like what the justice system was saying and what, you know, white Mississippi was saying was no, right? And so part of what I wanted to do was why I felt that it was important to write, you know, especially the story of my brother, to write it, you know, as a work of creative nonfiction, is because I wanted to say, you know, actually, yes, like he existed. This is who he was. This is who he was to me. You know, these are all the people who loved him. This was our lives, you know, together. This is how complicated he was, you know, like he was a person. He was here. He was real, right? It's not imagined. And so for those reasons, I think it was really important to me to write, you know, to write my memoir, to write Men We Reaped as creative nonfiction. I feel like you know, all of my fiction, I feel like it's influenced in one way or another by real life, right? But I feel like there are other writers, perhaps other novelists, and perhaps short story writers who I think channel more of their life into the work. Like there's much more of like a one-to-one correlation, perhaps between different characters or things that happen in the book. And I don't know, I feel like for whatever reasons that's less true, maybe, of me and my work.
So you're
far.
Because I think the natural impulse of many readers who are reading literary fiction, and I don't even really like that term, but I think the sort of sometimes false demarcations of what is literary fiction versus genre fiction versus any fiction plays a construct of publicity and marketing. And I understand why it exists, but I think it sometimes shortchanges not people who are genre fiction writers, and then also like if you're a literary writer, it's like you write beautifully, but you don't have a plot.
Right.
It's, you know,
right.
It's like these are things that are
Right.
mutually exclusive.
Right.
But I think that the assumption of a lot of readers when they read what we have come to understand as literary fiction, especially, and I don't know if that's a construct of like this period of time that we're living in where autofiction is like much more discussed, is that like, oh, the protagonist of the story is the writer,
Right.
or is at least a sort of avatar
Right.
for the writer. And so what you're saying though is that like it's always etched.
Etched.
Etched is you're saying you and etched are not the same.
Not at all. Yeah, not at all. I feel like not at all. I mean, I think that perhaps some of my writing around Esh was maybe informed by, you know, my sort of, I guess, life as a teenager, right? In how she feels uncomfortable in social situations, how sometimes she's awkward, she's very aware of how she is perceived and how others perceive, you know, the people around her, right? I think that awareness, maybe, I think that some of that comes from my own life. But like, as far as, you know, like one-to-one correlations with, you know, with her family background, with the relationships that she has with her siblings, with, you know, how she understands her sexuality, how she understands her gender, right? All of that, that's all Ish, you know? And I feel like that with each of my characters, I feel like I do contribute something to each of them. So it's harder in Sing Unburied Sing because I think, you know, like there are aspects of JoJo's character, right? Where I think aspects of his relationship with his mother, where he's aware that he wants her to care for him in a certain way, and he's so hungry for it, and she's not giving that to him. Like, I think that some of that may come, from my background or from, things that I saw in families around me, right? But that's just like one aspect of his character. And then like in Let Us Descend, I think that, one of the things that the main character Annis in Let Us Descend, one of the things that she's, struggling with is she's struggling with grief, right? Because she loses her mother at the very beginning of the novel, right? And one of the things that I felt like I learned, that I learned about, I think, the experiences of enslaved people when I was writing Let Us Descend is how so much of their lives were bound up in grief, right? Because they were constantly like losing people that they loved, both people, that they were related to, and then in their found families and made families, right? So they were like constantly wrestling with these like fresh iterations of grief. And so I think that her experience of grief is informed by my experience of grief, right? But that's it, right? For me, like each of the especially the main characters in my novels, they're real people. I mean, I feel like it's part of the reason that it's easier for me to write from a first person perspective is because in the same way that I think the reader is able to sink into my novels, right? And experience the story and the character and the world as it is happening, I'm able to do the same thing as I'm composing, because it feels like the person who is telling the story, like it's not me, even though I know it's me, but it doesn't feel like it's me. It almost feels like I'm channeling this voice, like I'm channeling this person, like they're sitting just beyond my eyesight here, and they're leading me where they want me to go. So they always feel very distinct from me, but at the same time, I am aware, I guess, that I'm making I'm writing this, I'm making these decisions, but it doesn't feel that way. I know that, I don't know. That's
No, I hear it. I was struck by one thing you said about how enslaved people are like always kind of perpetually in the state of grief, and I think one of the things I learned when writing my book that I didn't fully understand until the sort of research process was just the ongoing, perpetual, like unceasing sense of precarity, right? That like your presence at any given place, your life, your relationship to another person is so fragile.
right.
I think I knew it. Like I knew like, oh, people are, sold away, people die, people, but I didn't for some reason I didn't fully appreciate how like for every enslaved person, there was this sense that at any moment, like the person you love could be sold away, your child, your husband, your wife, your mother, your father. And, I always try to do these sort of like empathic historical exercises, try to make myself more proximate to history in whatever I'm writing about. And when you think about it in the context of enslavement, when I'm just like, I think about my family, the four of us, and like waking up one day and my children are gone. I don't know where they went. I don't know who took them. I don't know if I will ever see them again. It's so viscerally, I mean, I don't want to say it's unfathomable because it happened. And in different contexts, it still happens in different sort of geopolitical contexts today. But the idea that you could be stripped away from the people you love, that your own life could be stripped away from you. It like I remember when I was a kid, and I think like many of my students, I used to teach high school. And when we read Toni Morrison and talked about slavery, it would always be like, why didn't they just run away? Like, feel like, Smith, nobody would ever do that to me. Like, I would run away. I'll beat them up. Like, I fight them. I punch the dog. Like, all that. I'm like, all right, cool. But I didn't understand the way that even if you were able to escape, that you were, that one, it was virtually impossible to escape with children, right? So like just children were incapable of making the journey,
Right.
From especially the deep South,
Right.
like even Maryland,
Right.
used to try and go from Maryland to New York, that it was so difficult to make that journey and so dangerous for kids, that it was in some ways just like a suicide mission,
Right.
and that it was hard to make it with big groups of people. It was hard to, and so then you have these folks who are in this position where like, even if you are physically able to leave, and even if you are able to make your way through the swamp, make your way, traveling at night and not die from disease, or die from bears or wolves or snake catchers, that you have to accept that you either have to choose to try to do it with your family, which makes it more unlikely that you will make it,
Right.
that you will, if you do then, or if you do it, you have to leave your family behind.
Right.
And even if you are successful in doing it, even if you travel from Georgia to Canada and make it by yourself, and that's a decision you have made, that your family back at the plantation will be punished for what you've done, right? And so, and for some reason, I just didn't understand that. And so the sort of, we kind of talked about like this sense of paralysis. Like I feel like there was a sense of paralysis that existed for enslaved folks, because you felt stuck,
Right.
Like you're like, running away is not just a question of like, am I physically capable of doing it? I'm
Right.
brave enough.
Right.
It's like, what is the sort of ethical and human calculus
Right.
of what I'm going to do? And even if it's not your family, even if your family, like that, there will be people who will be punished on your behalf.
Right.
And it just, and to go back to what we were saying before, like I think there is like an unspoken grief in that, the sort of the grieving of the impossibility of choices.
Right.
That like any choice you make to go or to stay is one that is laden with consequences,
Right.
for you, for the people you love.
Right.
And I think that's what slavery was,
Right.
like this series of impossible choices.
Right.
And I think that's what so many iterations of Black life throughout history, the history of this country, have been. It's like the impossibility of being presented with a series of impossible choices and having to decide like, what's the best one,
Right.
and then making a decision and not knowing if
Right.
it was the best one.
Right. Right. I think that like thinking about that, like a series of impossible or that multitude of impossible choices, and like thinking about that idea, that they're like constantly sort of struggling with different kinds of grief, right? I think that changed my understanding of resistance, because I think before I began to research Let Us Descend, I thought, I thought like your high school kids, right? I was like, oh, like resistance was about running away, or uprisings, right? And that was it. Like that was those are my ideas about resistance, right? And I think that maybe part of the reason that that we do face some resistance, I think within the Black community when it comes to work, like ours, right? That wrestles with chattel slavery, is because I think people are coming to it with those ideas in their head, right? That, well, they weren't resisting, right? And why did they accept this, right? I wouldn't accept this, right?
It's like a shame.
Right, there's a shame in that, right? And when I was, researching American chattel slavery and thinking about grief and thinking about, like how enslaved people were even just in like the fact that they like woke up in the morning and got up out of bed, right? And that more of them did not make the decision not to, and unalive themselves. Like, it just made me think that everything was an act of resistance, right? Like, choosing to live and to get up in the morning and to breathe and to do these things in your day that would keep you sort of safe, right? Or that would, make it possible for you to continue to breathe. And then sleeping and then getting up the next day and doing it again. Like, I don't know, for me, it then meant that I looked at the entire lives of enslaved people, and I thought their whole lives were an act of resistance, right? Because they're making that choice over and over again to exist in the face of, of monstrous, inhumane, violence.
And I think to build on that, to like making a choice for themselves, and like I think about all the time, and I tell people all the time, is that like, what is true is that, first enslaved people came to the British colonies and become the United States in 1619, Emancipation Proclamation 1863, Civil War ended 1865, slavery in a formal context ends. And so you have, 250 some odd years of enslavement. And what is true is that from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for emancipation. What that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. But I think, I think about what sort of responsibility this bestow upon me.
Right.
To fight for things that I know that I might not see.
Right.
In my own lifetime, but to fight for it anyway because that is what was done for me.
Right.
And sometimes when I say that, I think people can think about like fighting or just say resistance in the sort of like myopic ways that we were taught to think about it.
Right.
Running away.
Right.
The slave revolt.
Right.
Trying to poison the master. Kill all the white people.
Right.
Plantation. To be sure, those were ways that did it. But I think your point of like reconceptualizing or creating a more holistic way to think about what resistance looked like. And I think the very choice of like waking up and living for yourself and for enslaved folks with that kids, like to continue to live for them.
Right.
In spite of, like, I know as a parent now how difficult it can be to like feel like I'm being a good parent when I'm going through my own stuff. Right. You got your own stuff going on, home life, personal life, work life, whatever.
Right.
You think about that. This is like to the nth degree of right. Like when you are subjected to an unceasing level of depravity, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and you have to be a good parent for your children. Like that level of that additional level of ability to still like be a mother, be a father, a chosen mother, a chosen father. That we know these were split apart so much. Auntie, uncle, grandma, grandpa. That it was just like not knowing, like not necessarily with the idea that like I'm gonna do this so that one day my child can be free, but I'm gonna do this so that to the extent possible, like my child can feel loved, can feel protected, feel to the to the extent that they can provide that. I just think that that's such an important piece of it to like expand our understanding of what that sort of resistance, to your point, and that sort of fight looks like. Because it wasn't how I was taught about it when I was a kid.
Right. And I think it's really important too, like what you're saying about, about the ways that we can take that understanding, from and apply it to now, right? I mean, I don't know. I think about the people in my family, in my extended family, in my community, right? And I think that like that idea, right, that resistance doesn't look like one thing, that resistance can look like many things, right? Resistance can express itself in many ways, right, in your life. I think that enables me, I don't know, to like look at the people around me and to see resistance in their lives in the most like mundane of actions, right? Where it's I think about that phrase like Black joy is resistance, right? And I feel that, right? But I also think that, that Black parenting is resistance. I think that, Black kinship, that, creating different kinds of relationships and community. I think that's resistance, right? I think Black art is resistance, right? So like, I guess my experience of learning more about our past, I think enabled me to see our present, and the ways that, that we resist and push back against, all that, that is in opposition to us. I think that it just allowed me to, it empowered me in a way, I think. And, and you briefly said something about that earlier, right? That like learning about the past, it didn't depress you, right? That it empowered you in a way. And I feel like, I feel the same way, with a lot of the reading that I did, in order to write about chattel slavery, that it just allowed me to feel, more empowered. And it's one of the reasons why I feel like it's really important, because, sometimes people ask me about the book banning, yeah. Right? And that's one of those reasons that I always say, like, I know that, people don't necessarily, as we were talking about earlier, they don't want to engage with this all the time, right? And it is about finding a balance. But I think it is important for us to tell these stories so that they are accessible and so that they are there and so that, and so that we are very actively resisting that, I guess, the rewriting of our history, which, I am not a student of history in the way that you're a student of history, but from little that I know of history, like it seems like, that this has happened again and again and again and again, right? Like this push to rewrite our experience, our history from a different perspective, to sanitize it, to erase it, right? To have, the textbooks in, Florida and Texas, and them saying that we got, that enslaved people receive valuable life skills, right? From being enslaved, which is ridiculous, right? And so, I don't know. So I just, I think that I do struggle with it sometimes, right? Because I know, like, if I just relaxed a bit, if I wrote, stories that were maybe a little happier, not as, maybe perhaps not centered in the kinds of lives and realities that I write about, I could probably sell a lot more books, and I could probably reach a much wider audience, right? And I know there's a certain amount of resistance to my work because I write hard stories, uncomfortable stories, I guess. But I don't know, but this is what I'm called to do. Yeah. I don't know. That sort of went off on a tangent there.
No, I appreciate it. It's, it's interesting. I think Black joy is resistance. Mm-hmm. I think that illuminating, bringing attention to the ways in which Black people celebrate and love and laugh and live in all the ways that exist beyond the context of that which is attempting to inflict violence against us, is profoundly important. I keep going back to this both and like that's my kind of ethos of all of this. Sometimes I do fear that there can be and trends and history is always something that swings back and forth. So I think that, we lived through the Black Lives Matter movement. We lived through, Trayvon Martin was killed in like 2012. Which is kind of the unofficial beginning of the incessant sort of viewing of and being proximate to and hearing of like Black people being killed at the hands of the state and vigilante. And I was like, and then we had George Floyd in 2020, and obviously all of the men and women and folks between that and there. And now we have the backlash to that period, in which, as you said, like state legislatures across the country are attempting to prevent teachers from teaching the very history that explains why the society looks the way that it does today. And I think that one of the downstream effects of the battle against like wokeism and the legislative battles and the book banning is that even people who are sympathetic to the things that we are writing about and thinking about, there almost can become a sort of weariness that they like. It is not the case that it is only like racist white people who are who don't want to engage with society. But I do think that it's an important distinction to be made between like Black people who are trying to moderate and be cognizant of how and when and to what extent they engage with that history. And though as a means of self-preservation, as a means of like being able to get up in the morning, as a means of not being overwhelmed by the violence that exists in the world and the violence that exists on our screens, in our books. So I want to put that here, say that that's one thing. And I get that. I don't want that to be an excuse for us not to engage with it. But like, if I don't expect people to, every time they sit down, watch like a Skip Gates documentary, or watch like, a movie about slavery or Eyes on the Prize. Like, you should also watch The Blind. You should also watch, whatever bingey Netflix, or Hulu thing. Because that's what I do. It's the same thing. So I want to put that there. That's one thing. But then I think the other part is like people who are attempting to prevent young people and people more broadly from having access to information that explains the sort of like political reality of the world that we live in today. And those, it might be two different groups of people who at different times are like not trying to watch Will Smith and Emancipation, but not for the same reason. So I think I want to say that. And then also on the Black Joy piece, like I think there can be like an overly reductive way to think about Black joy, which suggests that because if everything is joy is resistance, then we're almost doing the opposite end of what we were doing before, which is like, if we're saying that like the only resistance in slavery that we were taught was like running away and having an uprising, and now we're like, well, joy is resistance. This is how I resist. I think that I just want to create space for us to say that is one mechanism by which we do resist, and it is one that has gone underappreciated, under discussed in the history of Black life. But I also do think that it can't only be joy is one form of resistance. And I don't want the pendulum to swing so far to the other side that we're not also conceiving of how resistance is other stuff. And that you can sort of like, that it's not these are not singular choices you have to make, right? It's not like I am a joy, I am a rest is resistance person. I am a joy is resistance person. I am I'm watching Eyes on the Prize every night. Like, we're people. We're complicated people. Just like the characters in your novels and I just think that there has to be room for all of it. And I think that one of the things we don't do well as a country is like hold all of it and say yes to this and to this and to this. And we have to understand that there's a sort of balancing that looks different in different periods of your life, different times of your life. Some days you might wake up and you'd be like, I'm not in a place where I want to engage with this kind of thing. Maybe I don't read, Let Us Descend today. Maybe I'm going to go read, I don't know. I'm looking out and then all these things. King Cake. I'm going to read the big book of King Cake. Oh, I love King Cake. Right. So like some days you need the big book of King Cake. Some days you need Let Us Descend. Right. And I think that it's okay to have both on your bookshelf and to have days where you pick one up and don't pick up the other.
Right.
Should we look at some of these cards?
Yeah, we can.
Let's see. Can you describe a significant goal you have pursued in your creative life and the strategies that you use to overcome any obstacles along the way?
This may be a dissatisfactory answer, but the first thing that comes to my mind is writing my first book. I mean, I think,
which was not Somer's Bond. Which was not Somer's Bond. I think we all think that Somer's Bond is the first one. Yeah. But there was another one before that.
Right. It's called Where the Line Bleeds. It was published through a small publisher based in Chicago called Agate Baldwin. And at that time, when I sold the book to them and when it was published, it was, I think, much more difficult for Black literary writers. Gosh, I wish I had it in front of me. Around 2009, I think.
Because Salvage came out in 2011?
Yes, I think. So yeah, it was like, well, maybe it was 2008. But during that time, I feel like I think it was even more difficult for Black writers who were writing more literary fiction rather than pop fiction, right? Or at least what the publishing industry saw as literary fiction. It was much more difficult for them to be published because I think, I would go around to different publishers, like with my agent, when we were sort of shopping around my first novel, and they would say things like, like the paperback, department, like they don't see an audience for this. Like they don't think that it will sell, right? So in other words, what they were saying is, right, like no one's going to read, like we won't be able to sell this, right? People aren't interested in engaging with these types of stories. So I ended up publishing with a really small publisher that was like invested in publishing Black literary writers. And later, a few years later, they published Kiese Layman.
Novel?
They published the novel. And then I want to say did they publish the essays? But then when he go to Bloomsbury first? Was it with Kathy at Bloomsbury?
Is this the novel that was republished?
Yes, it was republished, right, with Scrivener. So I mean, I think just at that time, there was no, people didn't think that there was any sort of audience for it. And I was internalizing all of that. Like, even though I love the people I write about, I love the stories that I was telling, I understood that they weren't perfect, right? But I don't think that I would have been doing it if I didn't believe that they were worth being told and that they were worth witnessing, right? But I did get to a point where I almost quit.
Right.
Yeah, because I kept like revising that first novel, bringing it back again, to publishers before I signed, took it to that smaller publisher. And, and they just kept coming up with like new reasons for why it didn't work and why it wasn't a good fit for them and why, and I think that it's difficult for writers who are first starting out to, I think, understand that and especially then, because things were different back then. I can think it's a bit easier now, right? Because I think that the publishing industry's ideas about what will sell and what kind of books, will garner like a reading audience. I think that it's expanded a bit, right? I think there's more room now. But back then, there really just wasn't a lot at all. And so I began to just internalize it. And I thought, well, maybe this is not. Maybe they're not worth reading. Like maybe no one's interested in, in this. And I think because it was my first book too, I just, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I was just, mimicking some of what I saw out in the world. Some of the writers who I, admired, trying to, follow their, form. Morrison, of course, Faulkner, of course, Alice Walker, Ntozake Shange, Louise Erdrich, I really love, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Those are some of them. But yeah, so I was just, trying to, I don't know, use some of the tools that I feel like I had sort of learned from them, and trying to sort of, synthesize all of that and apply them to my world and into my characters. But I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think about it and it's like, I'm very grateful to my younger self because like I had the audacity to believe that I can do it, even though the world was constantly telling me that I couldn't, right? And I'm hearing that not only from the publishing industry, right, from literary magazines to publishing companies, but I'm also hearing that some of that more negative feedback in the classroom, right? Because the kind of writing that I was doing was not the kind of writing that was admired, right? Because my prose was too convoluted and, and the people I was writing about, they weren't white New Yorkers or... That's what you were hearing in your MFA program? Yeah. I mean, I think some of the feedback that I got, people just, some of the kids in my course, some of the writers, my peers, they understood what I was trying to do, and they gave me feedback that was tailored to what I was trying to do and that was helpful, right? But I think that there were others because of the kind of people that I write about, right? Because of the community that I come from, the reality is so different. They just couldn't. They couldn't access it. They couldn't see my characters as people. They couldn't engage with it in any like seriously critical way, I think. I almost gave up, but there was just a part of me that was just stubborn, and I think there was a part of me that was stubborn. There was a part of me that just loved the people that I wrote about so much and the place that I wrote about so much that just refused to give up, because to give up would mean that I didn't love that place and I didn't love those people in the way that I did, right? Or at least in my head, that's what it felt like. And I think there was a part of me that, I don't know, that perhaps if I had known more about how publishing worked, maybe, or if I had if I had been more clear-eyed, I think, about the way the odds were stacked against me, I think that there was a part of me that would have given up. So you're like naivete. Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness you were naive and stuff.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to I don't know. Sometimes I think, you can, I think that you can work really hard and you can take all the, correct steps that you think that you have to take in order to, reach your goal or to get wherever you want to be. But I think that for me, in my experience, that intuition played that me sort of listening to that voice, that inner voice, that naive inner voice, maybe, right? That allowed me to get where I am today. And then just that sort of stubbornness that was closely aligned with the love that I have for, the people who I write about and the place that I write about, that enables me to get, to where I am now. Because I think it's just interesting because I feel like I think people looking at it from the outside just think, so she went to this MFA program and then she got this fellowship and then she did, she went to this small publisher and then from that small publisher, then she moved to this publisher, right? So it's a very here are the steps that you need to take, right, in order to get to this level of success. Whereas I think it's, it's messier than that. And I just feel like that I want to communicate that in my answer, that it's messier than that.
Yeah, it always is. I mean, I try to tell students that and young people that I meet and that, anybody who's engaging with my work that it's very easy, especially in the age of, it's always been easy, but especially in the age of social media, especially in the age of, the internet to create very
right
stories about how somebody has gotten where they are, even, on the level of the book and on the level of the career,
right?
I think for me, a version of that is he was a teacher and then he went to Harvard and then he wrote for the Atlantic and he published a book and he, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But they don't see the stuff in between. They don't see me failing my qualifying exam and almost getting kicked out.
Right.
They don't see me and my wife being told that we probably won't be able to have children.
Right.
Right. And the grief that existed then. And they don't, all of these different things that happen in the midst of your external successes. I think they have to be important parts of the story. Because, I feel like this is the theme of our conversation, but we're real people.
Right.
And life is not a mosaic of Instagram photos.
Right.
It is something that is filled with, I think when I wrote Above Ground and when I talk about it, I talk a lot about the simultaneity of the human experience, how our joy and our love and our laughter are not demarcated and compartmentalized in ways that are apart from our fear, our despair, our exhaustion, that they often coexist in the same body, in the same moment, that we are always carrying parts of each to different degrees. And I think all of us are. And I think, that has to be an important part of the story we tell about our work. And then, even on the book, people look at finished books and they're just writing is interesting because I think people often are think about writing in ways that they don't think about other pursuits, in the sense that a young person will sit down and try to write, and if they can't, they're I'm not a writer. It's too hard. I don't.
Right.
But we don't do that with other stuff. We don't do that when you sit down and play piano. Nobody expects you to play Coltrane the first time, or Bach. When you sit down and play basketball for the first time, nobody expects you to shoot like Steph Curry or dunk like MJ. It is understood in our sort of cultural milieu that you have to put the work in.
Right.
And so that's why I always tell people I wrote 60, 70,000 words of this book.
Right.
That got tossed out.
Right.
before I got to the first word of what would be the book.
Right.
Like a year and a half, 2 years of
Right.
like what I thought the book was.
Mm-hmm.
And then being like, oh, actually, those 4 or 5 chapters that I wrote,
Right.
those now are in the bin.
Right.
On my computer somewhere. But like, and I think a version of me years ago would have thought of that as like, oh, look at all this wasted time.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm more accurately understand it as like, that's the practice.
Right.
Right? Like that's the part of
Correct.
that is you going to the gym.
Right.
And like shooting 100 3-pointers.
Right.
That is you going into the, the music room and like practicing for 3 hours.
Right.
That is it is the cost of what you do. It is the book does not show up fully developed. It does not show up as a fully matured thing.
Right.
It goes through so many different iterations. So and even before you get to the stuff that you are revising, everything you write, everything you read before you come to the page, or before you get to what is ultimately the first page of the book, is not like, as I said, it's not a waste of time.
Right.
It wasn't preventing you from getting to the book.
Right.
That is the excavation that you need to do to get to the project in the first place. And that's why being a writer is like, it's hard. It's a blessing. It's amazing. It's like, I endlessly feel so lucky that I have a life of words, and ideas, and reading. And it can also drive you crazy.
Right. Right.
But I think all artists in their own way feel that way about their craft.
Right.
It's the thing you love. It's also the things that like drives you up the wall.
Right. It's funny that we're not funny, but it's interesting to me that we're talking about this now because, as you're saying it, it's very clear to me, right? That, and it's something that I always talk about, when I'm, when people ask me, about, like what I'm working on next, and then so sometimes normally I say, well, like I'm always trying to evolve as a writer. I'm always trying to grow as a writer and to challenge myself, right? And so it's like very clear to me when we're sitting here and you're talking about it, right? That, that it's all practice. It's all work. It's all part of this, of you like constantly evolving and learning and growing, right? And changing in your work. But I guess it's just funny to me, because at the beginning of every project, it's like I forget all of that because I feel like I'm at this point where, where nothing is there, right? Where I have nothing, or at least there's nothing on the page, right? I may have done, may have read book after book after book after book, right? And have all these ideas sort of bouncing around in my head and a vague understanding of like the world that I'm writing about. But there's always that point at the beginning where, I don't know, it's almost like I feel like I forget that I've done it before, right? Or I forget that it is possible, and that writing is about like that constant, sort of, struggling and evolving and pushing yourself and making yourself uncomfortable, right? I think that I forget that, and I guess I'm sort of thinking about that now because I'm at the very beginning of the next book that I'm working on, right? Where I'm in like, I'm in the trenches. I'm in like the first chapter, right? And I'm at this point where I have like 3 different beginnings on my computer, right? And I keep abandoning one beginning, and then I'll move to another beginning. I abandon one beginning, move to another beginning, because I just feel like I have no idea what's going on, right? And it's just like, as you were saying, like I'm finding my way towards like the true beginning of the story. But I guess, I don't know, I guess the entire process takes so long that you sort of forget what it takes to get to that point where you find your way.
Do you think that's like a unconscious mode of like self-preservation, where your body is
Probably.
like shedding
Probably.
everything that, like, okay, like let's forget those past 7 years,
Right.
so that
Right.
because maybe if you fully remembered, you'd be like,
Right. I don't want to do this again. Right.
I'm not gonna do this.
Right.
No, that's so interesting. I mean, I definitely am in like experience seasons to my like relationship to. I feel like in my career there have been seasons, because there are seasons of life. And you know, before we started, the camera started recording, like we were talking about our kids. And, like, when I wrote How the Word Is Passed, my kid, I mean, when I started that book, my son was like 5 months old.
Wow.
And my daughter hadn't even been born yet. And when it was published, they were 4 and 2. Now they are almost 7 and 5.
Right.
And so I'm in a very different season of their lives, which means I'm in a different season of my life.
Right.
Which means, and you know, we were talking before about like, now we're in like extracurricular,
Right.
basketball,
Right.
soccer practice,
Right.
and ballet,
Right.
stuff. And what, on a functional level, what that means is that like I have less time
Right.
to write
Right.
during the day, which is very different than my life before class,
Right.
which is like, you know, I was writing I did my best writing between like 10 p.m. and 2 p.m. You know, with like some chicken wings here and like a Heineken here. And I'm not built like that anymore.
Right.
Once the sun goes down, I'm like correct. But it's interesting because it, you know, after like drop off and before pickup, and you know, amid emails, administrative stuff, the window of time in which I have to write was like increasingly smaller.
Right.
And I think sometimes that feels overwhelming for me, because I look back and I'm like, man, I used to have like hours. Or I used to be able to like go on like big long retreats.
Right.
And I can't do that the same way. And so I've had to like reconceptualize my relationship to work. And also I think I've had to become more gracious to myself about like how much time I should be spending doing this. And I've also had to do a lot of things, but like ensure that I am not falling captive to like narrow capitalistic conceptions of productivity.
Right.
Because God willing, the thing about being a writer is not like working in a factory. Like we're blessed enough, we can write the rest of our lives.
Right.
My kids will only be kids for, you know, however many, the kids who will actually want to talk to you.
Right.
I'm like teenagers who are like, get on my face, man.
Right.
You like that window of time is so brief.
Right.
I think I just this past year, I've like more fully come to realize that. And I think it is made, like I wrote How the Word Is Passed in like a sort of existential, frenetic frenzy. Like it was like a confused this. Right. The work that is going to define.
Right.
You know, it's just, I put a lot of pressure on myself. And I've done my best to like try not to work with that sort of pressure.
Right.
And like to just let it, like, some days it's going to come.
Right.
Some days it's not. Some days you're going to use those 3 hours you got really well.
Right.
Some days you're going to sit there and bang your head against the computer.
Right.
But to remember, to come back to what we were saying before, that like, that's all part of it.
Right.
Right. Like that is, and even to move away from like good day and bad day.
Right.
Right. Just like this day looked like this.
Right.
This writing day looked like that.
Right.
And I think it's helped me, just like on a personal level.
Right.
Be more, a lot calmer.
Right.
And a lot more present for my family.
Right.
And not just present for the work.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, like when you said that about you know, like you having to sort of separate your work, or try to, I guess, I don't know, like shift your work away from, you know, like capitalist ideas about like productivity, you know, and how efficient you are, right? And, and I don't know how quickly you get things done, right? And then because I feel like a subtext in what you were saying is like, you said like, this is going to be this book that defines me as a writer, right? And that is going to do so much, right? For your career. And I feel like that's another thing that right now that I have been thinking about a lot and sort of struggling with, because I've been trying to remind myself, right, that this is not a competition. And I think we're made to feel like it's a competition, right? Because of the way that the publishing industry, is, because of the way that the publishing industry is, is set up, because of the way that it works, right? Because of the way that publicity works, because of, you know what I'm saying? Like I think that the entire structure is set up in such a way that it makes you feel like it's a competition, when in fact it is not a competition, right? Like it's about the art. It's about the love, that you have for the work that you do, and whether or not that work is, you're like speaking with your full authentic self and your full authentic voice. So that's something that I've actually been thinking about a lot recently, and having to like, and I know it sounds weird, because you wouldn't think that, I guess, somebody in my position would be like wrestling with that.
If it's competition, you're at the top,
right?
Of the, but it doesn't feel like
it. Doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like it, and it doesn't feel like it, and it has been, I think, in the same way, that it did when I was writing my first book. Like it's been, as I'm working on this new book, it's been making me feel like I've been sort of doubting myself, right? I've been doubting myself. I've been doubting my abilities. I've been doubting, the work that I've done, I've been doubting everything. And so one of my friends who's a writer, just, he was asking me how I was doing, and I was telling him how I was doing. And then he was like, yo, it's not a competition. I know they make us feel like it's a competition, but it's not a competition, the work is the work. And so I don't know. So your comment reminded me of that. And so I thought I'd share, because I don't know. I mean, I think that it's easy for us to sort of feel that way, because it's, I don't know, in some ways I feel like sometimes we feel like it's like Highlander, right? Like there can only be one. But it's not, right? I mean, the work is the work. The stories are the stories, I mean, they're the things that, that will bear real fruit in the world, right? And usher beauty into the world, and will hopefully still be here, and still be, people will still read them, and they'll still be hopefully affecting real change in the world even after we're not here. So I don't know. I have to remind myself of that, I think. And I think it's, I don't know, useful to share that, because I think if more of us, were aware of the fact that it's not a competition, I think, I don't know, like I wonder what we would be capable of in our art. Like I wonder how our art would grow, and how it would evolve, and how it would change, and what kind of freedom that we might feel, and the kinds of stories that we, tell, and the way we tell our stories, if we, I don't know, if we sort of shrug off this idea about competition.
Well, I'm very grateful to you. I'm grateful to your work. I think I speak for so many of us where, saying that like, you don't have to prove anything to anybody. You are, it really is like just on it's an honor for me to be able to sit with you, because like your work is canon for so many of us, and but I also understand that you're a person with some kids,
struggling,
bills,
right?
The insecurities like we all,
right?
But this has been a delight.
Thank you.